Hello, welcome to Carlson Techtalk, a series of interviews with experts in information technology and networking industry. I'm your host, Soumya Sen. Welcome to the talk. We begin our discussion today with the big question of the day, the FCC's vote on network neutrality. The proponents of this rule argue that network neutrality and a very strong network neutrality rule would prevent blocking of traffic to certain websites and even prevent paid prioritization by carriers and will improve consumers' experience. The opposition, however, believes that this is going to slow down investment in network infrastructure, and this rule is really trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist in reality. And more importantly, the open internet rules will for the first time apply fully to mobile networks. And the question therefore is, will these regulations solve the problems of spectrum crunch, the network congestion issues, and investment in wireless networks? To answer these questions, my guest today is Mr. Paul Polakos of Cisco, who has been at the core of inventing many of the key wireless network technologies. Paul has been a veteran of Cisco Systems. He's a Cisco Systems Fellow, and prior to joining Cisco Systems, he had been the director of the wireless research division of Alcatel-Lucent Bell Labs, where he worked on developing many of the key network access technologies. And currently at Cisco, he's leading a team of researchers on standardization of 5G networks. So Paul, in the previous video that we did in this interview series with Keith Cameron, we talked to him about network neutrality and got his perspectives about the entire network neutrality debate from the carrier's side of the point of view. And today we are going to ask you the same questions about your views on net neutrality and try to get the view of from the perspective of a hardware vendor like Cisco and how they feel this kind of rules are going to impact the internet ecosystem. So the first question that I have for you is from Jeffrey Retswich, who wants to know what are your views on net neutrality debate. And a related question is from Eric Sebesma, who wants to know what is the impact of FCC's decision on regulating the internet for Cisco and other big iron internet companies? And what is the impact, do you think, of this decision on the future of internet pricing for consumers, for businesses, and for service provider? Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And of course, it's been a very hot question also that's been debated quite a bit over the past several years as the internet has evolved and also mobile data networks have evolved also. So I'll give you the perspective from the mobile operators and how their business has evolved since the first days of mobility as we sort of moved through mobile networks being built to support voice communication through the generations of development of the digital age and moving to digital telephony, and then the emergence of the smartphone and the fact that today telephony has become sort of subservient to data communications, social communications, the very different use cases that we have in the internet today sort of dominate and have changed the flavor of the way the network is being used compared to the way it was used many years ago. And so this is leading to sort of a rethinking of how the technology that supports this being developed. But in addition to that, it's also changes and affects the business landscape. And I think when we talk about net neutrality, we're really talking about how the business landscape has evolved since the early days of the internet and since the earlier days of mobile telephony. We're now on the 4th generation mobile network, and over the past 25 years, we've gone through these 4 generations. And the current generation is really focusing on broadband mobile data service, as opposed to going back to the early days voice telephony. So it's a very, very different communication model, but it also is a very different business. And the business today is really driven by the diversity of third parties that are seeking to connect to individuals that are mobile via the internet and via the service provider mobile network. So, you know, when we think about net neutrality, we're really thinking about how the business world has evolved since the earlier days of the internet and mobile telephony and where we are currently today, and whether the rules that we had in the early days, which served a certain level of investment in infrastructure and building out our networks, to today where there's value not only in building out the networks, but there's value in promoting all of the services and all of the third parties that communicate over the network. And I think this is the difficult job that the FCC has in how to balance sort of the interests of both of these sides in sharing in this vast sort of economic reservoir and make sure that it's fair. So, you know, as part of it, there's been a lot of discussion on the service provider side about trying to, for many years, service providers have been evolving towards first connecting people, and then how do they provide sort of value-added services for those people, for their subscribers, And one of the ways of doing that was to try and provide them with a better experience while operating on the network. And so in doing that, there are different business models that could be built. One of them is providing faster highways or faster lanes or something like that for the third parties that are using the network to connect with the service provider subscribers. And in that process, while the outcome seems to be a favorable outcome, it in the sense of improving the experience for the end user in receiving a service over the network, it could also be that process might lead to some sort of unfair or an imbalance in the way that the third parties compete in using the internet as a shared resource. And this is the concern of the FCC, and that balance can change over time. And I believe that the FCC now believes that it's changed in a way that if the broadband providers are left with full latitude to implement whatever choices they want to make, they may unfairly disadvantage some of the smaller businesses that use the internet and the mobile network. So this rule, I think, was put into place now where this transition has occurred because the industry has matured to the point where we really look at the internet as a shared public resource. And we want to make sure that the parties that have control of that perhaps don't make some of the wrong decisions that may be well-intended, but lead to some kind of an economic imbalance that potentially could hurt growth and evolution over the longer time scale. So it's for me, you know, I'll be honest with you, I operate more on the technical side. It's a very, very difficult decision to make. I think the FCC, while they've made the decision, let's say the fortitude with which and how they go about enforcing this, I think is going to be very, very carefully measured because they're aware of the potential for slowing things down, for stifling investment in the internet if this really went the wrong way. So I think they want to protect the service providers. They will allow the service providers to fairly provide differentiated services, but they just want to be careful that the scales don't get tipped in the wrong way.
So Paul, Eric has a related question for you. So Eric Sebesma wants to know, do you think that the increasing scarcity of wireless spectrum will cause an increase in the market demand for low coverage area technologies such as microcell, picocell and femtocell technologies where wireless accessibility can be mixed with fiber optic delivery?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the fight over the past 20 years, if we're really looking at radio technology and wireless technology, was to increase the efficiency that we use the spectrum that we've been allocated. And so there's a belief that we'll always be fighting for more spectrum, but whatever spectrum is granted or licensed, whether it's licensed or unlicensed, has to be used very efficiently. When you look at sort of the evolution of technology, we're operating in link efficiencies that are very, very close to the theoretical limit. So we're within a factor of 2 of the theoretical limit on these commercial systems. So there isn't a lot of space to really gain more spectral efficiency just by trying to improve the technology. One of the other ways of getting better use of the spectrum is by spatial reuse, which means that we go to smaller and smaller cells, and we deploy a lot more of them. And this is the trend that we've predicted over the past 10 years, and we're seeing that sort of play out now as we move from sort of the macrocellular design or domain into the microcell domain and the small cell domain. And we'll continue to see that. There is a back pressure that comes from the cost of, not of the cost of the cells, but the cost of deploying and operating so many cells and the cost of providing backhaul to them. So there is an OpEx trade-off between having a macro cell that has a large coverage area and a small cell that requires still some substantial operations cost to first to deploy and then to keep it operating, just in terms of the monthly costs of backhaul, despite the fact that it gives us a lot more spectral sort of reuse of the spectrum. So the answer is yes, we'll see more deployment of small cells, but at the same time, the shift now will be in how we build out the backhaul in a low-cost way that these small cells can efficiently use them and at an acceptable cost. We may also see sort of the emergence of more radio-like backhaul, which will just sort of help defray the cost of operations of the small cell network.
So the next question is from Brett Eliasson. And Brett wants to know, do you think that the cellular industry can keep up with the ever-growing demand for mobile data? The FCC has been trying to free up more spectrum for cellular use. And can the combination of that and some other new technologies such as 5G networks help keep pace with that growing demand?
Another good question. The answer is the demand will certainly drive the industry to figure out how to meet that demand. It's just economically favorable to do that. We'll probably use every tool that we possibly can. So there's a lot of work going on in the LTE domain in 4G to provide better ways of managing networks, of coordinating the activities of different cells, of managing lots of cells, to change the price points of operating those networks. And at the same time, there's a lot of activity going on in how to extend the usable range of frequencies that would be applied to wireless communication. I'll call it wireless communication because we evoke a certain kind of thinking when we say mobile in terms of licensed or cellular activity. It really refers to the licensed radio regime. And as we go into the future, we'll see certainly a continued and very, very dominant or important presence of licensed spectrum and the use of licensed spectrum, but also the use of unlicensed spectrum together with licensed spectrum. We'll see movements towards higher frequencies and shorter ranges, and there is some activity right now going on in the tens of gigahertz all the way up to 60 gigahertz range, which in the past wouldn't have been considered for sort of personal communications like systems. So that's one whole thing that's going on. Although you did raise the point about going for 5G, something about 5G, and what probably get is that while there's a lot of discussion about 5G and the emergence of 5G and the need for 5G, our feeling is that the reality is going to be that we're going to continue, just because of the investments that have been made in the 4G networks and the plans to evolve the 4G networks, that we'll continue to do that as long as we possibly can. This isn't something that's, I think this is just going to be driven by conventional economic principles that we've got the service providers have to protect the investments that they've made in the networks, and at the same time they have to meet the market demand. So the easiest way to do that is through incremental steps. But we've argued that when we make the step to 5G, it should not be an incremental step. That'll be probably laying a new foundation for our mobile networks, where we can actually put them, after we've sort of depleted the improvements we can do in the 4G network, we move on a new cost curve defined by a new foundation that we can build the next generation mobile network on. I'll mention one more thing that's a very important transition that's occurring right now that's not related to the 4G, 5G thing, but the effect of cloud and the effect of function virtualization, network function virtualization, is leading to a very, very different paradigm for the cost structure of mobile networks. And so we're going to see a lot of the hardware-oriented boxes and functions that were gateways and everything that we did in the past. Those are all virtualized or being virtualized, can be orchestrated within a service provider cloud in a way that gives the service provider a lot more latitude and flexibility in how they configure and manage their network, and how they grow their network, and how they scale it to demand. So all of these things sort of speak to giving them more life in the current technology, while on the research side, we can be working on really what the next foundation should be for mobile networks for 5G.
So Paul, you mentioned about a move towards using unlicensed spectrum in the industry. So Sarah Martin has a question for you. From Cisco's viewpoint, do you see actual workplaces shifting towards a Wi-Fi model of connectivity, getting away from the traditional plug-in workstations and having a more mobile environment at the office?
Yeah, that's really, we debate that here. I can, there is a reason for thinking that would happen, but if I look at the workplace today, and maybe even go back a few years and then try to project into the future, most of the communication in the past has been, I need a phone on my desk and I need a terminal that I can do, I don't know, a few megabits per second or something like that. Now we get into very collaborative environments. As we move to the future, the current model of how we work in our offices is going to get much richer from a data perspective also. So with the idea that would it be advantageous to just do all wireless communication within the office space? At some point we may be able to go to that, but it's not really clear it's advantageous right now. I mean, we have a mix of wireline and wireless, and we have very good wireless coverage, but I anticipate that we're going to be pushing the boundaries of that wireless also forward, just because of the value that video and video collaboration plays in the workplace. So we'll wait and see.
So Paul, let's go back to the discussion about the 5G network technology and standardization. Can you tell us a little bit more about the standardization efforts that is going on? Because I learned that you have been leading a team of researchers at Cisco on the standardization of this technology. So what are the key improvements that we might expect to see, and what are the challenges that the standardization process faces today?
The industry is going through the exercise right now of trying to define what the major use cases that we're going to would be driving 5G. And these relate to Internet of Everything, machine-to-machine communication, in addition to just the standard growth of what we would say is like smartphone and human-to-machine and human-to-human communication. And it's an insightful thing to do, because what it does is it gives us a view of sort of the way we should structure this system to support the future. In general, what I can say is come out of some of that, and it's really just beginning right now, is that we see a huge diversity in the use cases compared to the way we used the network in the past, in the mobile network especially. So there was always in the past sort of a dominant use case that we were trying to meet in moving to the next generation. So when we went from 1G to 2G, it was going from analog voice to digital voice. From 2G to 3G, it was digital voice to spectrally efficient digital voice with web browsing. Going from 3G to 4G, it was going from web browsing to mobile video broadband. Going from 4G to 5G, that dominant use case doesn't pop out. It's a family of use cases with many, many, many different requirements. And so what this is beginning to show is that we may need to re-architect the way we do things, because we probably want to look at the network in a more horizontal way, where rather than sort of a vertical structure that we have today with a sort of very, very well-conceived single radio technology that attempts to support smartphones, video, everything that we're talking about, to maybe a structure where we have a network that's supporting many different radio access technologies that have different forms of mobility support, coupled into a network now that is maybe different from the one that we've built in the past, and one that considers mobility as a fundamental player, or as a fundamental capability, an intrinsic capability of the network, rather than as an overlay on top of a transport network. And so we're looking carefully. One thing that we're doing at Cisco is looking very, very carefully at information centric networking models that incorporate mobility, that incorporate security, and that incorporate storage as fundamental and intrinsic parts of the network fabric, rather than having these exist as separate networking overlays on top of our current network. And if we can actually build that kind of a model, then our belief is that we would have a much different cost structure, because things don't have to be managed separately. Then the operation, these functions don't exist separately. They just emerge as a natural part of the network. So, I think that in moving from 4G to 5G, we can take a much bolder step than we've taken in the past by really rethinking the foundation that we're building on.
So Paul, here is the last question for you today. You mentioned about the move towards Internet of Things, and in that context, Cisco is one of the big players that is promoting fog computing. So can you tell us a little bit more about this area of fog computing? What are the kind of challenges it solves, and what are the kind of challenges that are in the path of realizing fog computing?
Well, so the concept of fog is sort of an extension of cloud. So cloud sort of evokes the idea that we have this someplace sitting in the internet that we're connected through the internet to a data center, and in this data center we can do all sorts of things dynamically, and we can start up virtual machines that can execute almost any function. They can scale automatically and everything like that. The problem is that that's far from where we are. It's far from even in a network topological sense. The compute is all concentrated in one spot, and the idea of now taking cloud and making it a fog is the idea of pushing that compute out into the network and distributing that compute in the network. And so fog is sort of this first step, I would say, towards rethinking the fabric of the network, where when in the past we've really thought of the network as just strictly transport and connection oriented. The purpose of it is to connect somebody at one point to some point else, and you can move bits back and forth between them, hopefully efficiently. When we look at sort of some of the emerging requirements, especially things that speak to traffic management, and industrial environments, these sorts of things have very, very short latency requirements. And so the idea of fog is that some of that decision making is going to have to be pushed out very, very close to the edge. And so fog is all about how do we develop computing that we can put at different places in the network flexibly so that we can manage those use cases and those applications that have very, very tight latency requirements.
Well,
so it's a very rich area. Yeah.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today. And I really enjoyed the conversation with you. And thank you for the very insightful comments that you provided us with.
My pleasure, and thank you very much.
Well, viewers, I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well. And thank you for joining us today. And keep your eyes open for more segments and videos to come.